Good morning. My name is Tony. I'm the Illinois State Representative for NACCR Midwest Great Lakes, and welcome to the conference this morning. Welcome everyone to the second full day of NACCR 2026. We're glad to have you here. Before we get started, I want to make a few general announcements. As we have been saying all week, thank you to our sponsors for their generous support of NACCR. You see there's the sponsors on the screen. Without them, we would not be able to do many of the great things that are part of this conference. Many of these sponsors are also exhibiting, and we encourage you to visit them in the exhibit hall throughout the day. You may have noticed the two gigantic wooden fish near registration. We encourage you to stop by and paint one of your scales for the fish today. This will be the last day for painting, and we'll be assembling that at the end of the day. Additionally, we encourage you to stop by the chapter's oasis located next to the registration on the second floor. Modeled after Nature for All's youth oasis, our chapter oasis will feature a dedicated conference space for students in SEB/SER chapters to come together, learn from one another, and hold gatherings throughout the NACCR. Come learn about SEB/SER chapters and how to create one, create/join one, and the resources available to student-led projects in the region. As you should have noticed yesterday, each morning drinks and refreshments will be available in the exhibit hall prior to the plenary session, and immediately after, so you can refresh on your way to your breakout session. Additionally, lunch will be served Tuesday and Wednesday in the foyer in the exhibit hall as well. This afternoon, there will be an afternoon break with food and beverages available in the exhibit hall as well from 3 to 4 p.m. Immediately following the afternoon break, we will hold a poster session in the Baird Ballroom foyer where you've likely seen the poster set up. Be sure to stop by and talk with our poster presenters and enjoy some of those snacks and refreshments. This evening, we'll also host the Wild and Scenic On Tour Film Festival right here in this room from 7 to 9 p.m. We will have a great evening of films planned with both thought-provoking and entertaining content. As with many of our events, snacks and refreshments will be provided at this event. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's plenary. The plenary this morning has been organized by the Conference Program Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage and to moderate the plenary session, the Director of Lakeshore Nature Preserve at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Brad Herrick.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm going to invite our speaker to the stage behind me, and while they get settled, we'll chat a little bit about what we're going to talk about this morning. Again, welcome to this session on urban restoration and conservation. I can't see any of you because this light is really bright, but I can see shadows, so thank you for being here. I know that many of us that are restoration ecologists, conservation biologists, often work in the least glamorous, most degraded ecosystems, the sites that need the most work, the most research, and often those fall in urban environments or suburban environments. According to the UN, half the world's population now resides in urban environments, and that number is projected to increase to 70% over the next 2 decades. So, as such, in order to sustain biodiversity globally, including ecosystem services and functions, we'll necessarily need to work in these degraded spaces, these urban green spaces that can be oases for biodiversity, opportunities for restoration and conservation, working with the people that live in those communities. And this plenary brings together speakers from academia, nonprofit, the private sector, city government, and they're going to talk about restoration ecology, conservation biology, and urban environments globally down to hyper-locally, and share their experiences with us. So I'm going to quickly introduce each of our speakers so you know who is sharing the stage with me, and then we'll move right into their presentations. So on my left, we have Dr. Volker Radiloff. Volker is a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Volker studies how rapid land use and climate change affect biodiversity and wild places around the globe. Particularly in the U.S., he works closely with the Forest Service, Geological Survey, to monitor and develop tools to monitor the wild-urban interface and estimate its effects on wildfires and biodiversity. Next, we have Dr. Dan Smith, who's an assistant research scholar at the University of Florida. Dan has over 35 years of experience in conservation ecology and environmental planning. His primary research focus is studying movement patterns and habitat use of terrestrial vertebrates and integrating conservation transportation in land use planning in those efforts. Next here we have Aaron Fegestead. Aaron is a senior ecologist and a professional wetland scientist with Heartland Ecological Group. In that position, Aaron, as a consultant, he specializes in restoring and stewarding natural communities through assessment and inventory, design and planning, and field implementation. He's also the co-founder of the Southeastern Wisconsin Conservation Collaborative, where he works with community volunteers and leaders to conserve and steward remnant natural communities in and around urbanized areas. Next, we have Phil Nicodemus. Phil is the research director at Urban Rivers. So Urban Rivers is a nonprofit group dedicated to revitalizing urbanized waterways using novel artificial habitat structures, such as floating wetlands. Phil studies the ecological implications of waterways flowing through these heavily urbanized environments, where he designs, installs, and maintains structures with the means of diversifying these degraded stream resources and river resources. Lastly, but not least, Lauren Umek. Dr. Lauren Umek is a senior project manager in the Department of Cultural and Natural Resources in the Chicago Park District. In her position, Laura manages the design, stakeholder engagement, and implementation of natural area installation projects in Chicago's public parks. Her recent projects have integrated public access and recreation opportunities with habitat improvement along the Chicago River and Lake Michigan shoreline, as well as the conservation potential of these post-industrial landscapes, highly disturbed landscapes, and then the use of short-statured plant species to replace unused mowed lawn. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Volker Radloff to kick us off.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to speak. We live in an increasingly urban world, and that is a relatively new thing in the history of mankind, in the history of the planet. So it's just 100 miles south from here, 150 years ago, that Chicago was one of the cities that started skyscrapers and this type of urban development that we can now see all over the planet. In the US, for the last 20 years, more people live in urban areas than in rural areas, and that number is increasing rapidly due to migration. It's not that people in urban areas have that many more kids or so. That is a trend that we see here, that we see globally as well, as Brad alluded to. And so across the globe in these nighttime lights, we can see the big urban centers, especially in the eastern US, in Europe, and Southeast Asia, but really on every continent, and that is increasingly where people live. As urban areas grow, they encroach on wildlands, forests, shrublands, native vegetation, replace habitat and fragment it also. And this is one type of growth where the city is fairly well contained, but increasingly moving towards these more wild areas to the north here. But another trend that we often see is this kind of development where people build houses within wildland vegetation. Everyone has their 2 acres, 5 acres paradise or so. Both of these are wildland-urban interface, but we separate this first type as the interface WUI, where houses and wildland vegetation meet. The second one as the intermix WUI, where they intermingle. And it's this type of development that's the reason why the urban area is in the land area that is occupied by settlements or so is rising 2.5 times faster than the number of people living in urban areas. So let's look at Wisconsin and what this pattern looks like. So you see quite a bit of this wildland-urban interface in yellow and in orange around the urban centers, Milwaukee, Madison or so in the south, depicted in the dark red color. So the dark red colors is an urban area without much wildland vegetation, but surrounding it, especially in Milwaukee, there's quite a bit of this interface WUI around Kettle Moraine State Park and other places. But then you also see a lot of this orange. These are areas where wildland vegetation and houses intermingle, the intermix WUI, and that is throughout the state in many of the high amenity areas in northern Wisconsin, Door County, and so forth. This is a fairly new trend. When we switched to 1990, you see much less of this. I'm going back to 2020, and you see the jump in the area of this type of development. This has many reasons. Part of it that people can work more remotely, part of it that a larger proportion of the population is retirees, and that more jobs are in services, not requiring you to be close to a factory. Across the US in 2020, we have about 10% of the land area in wildland-urban interface. It's where about a third of the population lives. It's in the western states in California, the Colorado Front Range, Seattle area, but then also through large areas of the eastern US and much more widespread there because there's less public land and because you don't need access to a water main. You can develop more easily on a 2 or 5 acre lot and drill your own well. 1990, we had far less of this. And from 1990 to 2020, wildland-urban interface was the fastest growing land cover type. Globally, we have wildland-urban interface on every continent, of course in the US, but also in Europe. We see it in Southeast Asia and China, East Africa, Uganda, and so forth, the Atlantic forest of Brazil and in Australia. So thinking about conservation implications, people often like to live in places that are conservation hotspot. This is work by Kira Pfoch, who has a presentation coming up on Thursday looking at the wildland-urban interface in Mediterranean ecosystems. And of course, no one will surprise to see San Diego area, Southern California having a lot of wildland-urban interface, but so does Portugal, so does Chile, South Africa, and Australia, and these places that are so rich with endemic species. Indeed, when we look at species richness of all tetrapod in the global map there, and we break that into quartiles, then 85% of the wildland-urban interface is in areas that are above average in species richness. So people are living where we have a lot of species of concern. We can break this down into amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, and we see very similar patterns here where for amphibians, 92% of the wildland-urban interface is in above average richness areas, and that's because in dryland systems, amphibians needing water and people too, they settle in the same places. The only of these 4 classes that has a slightly lower rate is reptiles. Even there, 2/3 of the WUI is in high richness areas, but reptiles being so rich in Australia in the interior, so that's not a place people settle greatly. So how does this change the environment? Well, you may have heard the term wildland-urban interface in connection with fire. Tinderbox Valley, what could possibly happen in such a beautiful place we will build here? So as people build houses in the wildland-urban interface, they will ignite more fires. In Southern California, at a rate now that we have more fires than would be natural, and native chaparral cannot sustain because of invasive species fueling in a feedback loop more rapid fires. In other places, though, we have less fires than ecosystems may need to be healthy because of fire suppression and the protection of homes and so forth. Fire is only one issue, though, in the wildland-urban interface. We have habitat loss and fragmentation. As houses get built and soils get disturbed, they provide opportunities for ruderal species to invade, as does the landscaping that provides propagules for surrounding areas. We have subsidized wildlife or subsidized predators, cats and dogs, as they roam in the neighboring areas affecting wildlife populations. And they can spread diseases, but there's also the opposite of chronic wasting, Lyme disease and so forth affecting people. So yes, the first reaction, of course, when you see a house like that is a little bit to groan and say, what really, thinking about all the implication this has. But as I end here, I'd like you also to think about what this house also represents as the largest investment that family will probably make in their life. And they choose a place like that because they want to be close to nature. And that's a good starting point for conversations to build a constituency, to build a conservation movement. And 100 miles to the west of here, Aldo Leopold got his shack or so 70 years ago, 80 years ago. This is wildland-urban interface now too, but it inspired the Sand County Almanac. So I think we need to look at it as both. This is a conservation challenge, but it's a conservation opportunity as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Volker. Next, I'll invite Dan Smith to the stage.
This is the clicker. Green button, okay. All right, thanks, Brad, and good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm going to speak for a little while on corridors and crossings, and really looking at Florida's efforts to conserve and restore habitat connectivity for wildlife. So Florida is now the third largest state in the nation with 23.5 million people. It's expected to increase to 36 million by the year 2060. So tremendous growth and pressure on our natural areas. With urban growth comes more roads, and our road network now has about 268,000 linear miles of just major roads. That doesn't count the small neighborhood streets and everything. So, has tremendous impacts and widespread effects on this whole list of things. Volker went into some of these: habitat loss and fragmentation. I'm going to focus more on wildlife movement issues and isolation and wildlife vehicle conflicts. So in the face of this tremendous growth, we haven't been completely idle. We've recognized that probably starting back into the 70s, when growth in Florida really started to pick up, sort of on the heels of what happened in California, a couple of decades earlier. So by the time we got into the 80s, people were already thinking about what we were losing. Dr. Reed Noss, who's in the audience, was one of them. And him and another professor at the University of Florida, Larry Harris, came up with these ideas for doing a connected system of conservation areas. And there was a whole session yesterday on this, so I don't have time to go into detail on it. But basically, it ended up being the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which was adopted by the state in the late 1990s and has been a running program now for like 40 years. And it's a system of sustainable core areas and connecting corridors that is going to protect Florida's biodiversity for future generations, accounting for adaptation for climate change and for development pressure. So it's a really important program in the state to try to protect what we have left and address the tremendous population growth. I'm going to focus mostly on those last three bullets for the rest of the talk. So my career is, over the last 25 plus years, has been focused mostly on wildlife movement patterns and the impacts of roadways on habitat connectivity. You can see some of the modeling work. I've done quite a bit of GIS modeling. A lot of this is based on field studies and empirical data, not just on large carnivores and wide-ranging species, but also on a lot of different herps and other endemics and vulnerable species to road impacts. And so this is some of the work we've done to identify where conflict locations are and hotspots. And then once we know where the problem areas are and where future problem areas might be for species like the Florida panther that's expanding its range and reclaiming some of its former habitat, We can plan for things like wildlife crossings to try to address the conflicts and make roads more permeable. It's one thing to establish a conservation corridor network, but if you don't address the roads, those are significant barriers. If you have a road that's 50,000 cars or more, that's almost an absolute barrier for many species. So these are types of remedies we can use to address those impacts and increase permeability and habitat connectivity. One of the things that's come out of our work, working with the Florida Department of Transportation, is design and planning of wildlife crossings. And so we just recently came out with this new practitioner's guide that's ecologically based. And so it does include engineering and construction aspects, but it's all designed around ecological concepts and to try to get engineers and biologists, ecologists working together for a common goal to improve permeability of our roadways. The rest of my time I'm going to spend talking about a case study or an example of some work that I'm doing right now. I do work on many different scales, large scales, regional and local scales. This is a study just north of Orlando, which is a really high growth area with Disney World and all the tourist industry there. So you've got Ocala National Forest at the top of the map there, which is a really large reserve and has the most black bears in the state. About 1,200 adults reside in Ocala National Forest. And then down there at the south end of the map is Wekiva River Basin, which is really high quality habitat, but is fairly isolated. So if you look in the middle of the map, you can see there's a connecting corridor there, but it's only partially fulfilled. There's a lot of gaps in there. The bright green is what's protected. The darker areas are not protected. So there's a lot of gaps in there, and a lot of these gaps have smaller rural communities and some suburban sprawl, so it's threatening the connection, and that's that important source connection to keep that and sustain that population down in the south. So that we take a little bit closer look, you can see kind of the context around the Wekiva Basin. So it's urban development, those pink, yellow, and orange colors, that's all spreading urban development, and to the west, all of those areas that are open are filling in pretty rapidly. And so all that's left for this population is that little lifeline going to the north to sustain it. And we've been doing telemetry work on this population since 2014. We did a 2-year pilot study there using GPS collars, some of them equipped with cameras to record behavior and movement. And one thing we learned from back then, that the neighborhood areas and the surrounding urban areas serve as secondary habitat, particularly in times of drought, also maybe as a result of some prescribed burns in critical areas. And so these neighborhoods, they irrigate, they maintain their landscapes, so they're producing throughout the year whether there's a drought or not. So particularly in the fall when it's important and they're searching out mass crop, they'll go into the neighborhoods. Of course, they don't just eat natural foods. When they get in the neighborhoods, if there's human foods available, they're going to go after that. And so this just shows you an example of tracking of one bear that spent about 3 days in the neighborhoods before going back to the conservation area. And over on the left side is one of the camera collars, if it's large enough for you to see what it looks like. So let me see if I can make this work. I don't know how to press play. That's not going to do it. I don't know if the guy in the back can do it. Can you, how do I back up, do you know? Can you press the play button for me? No? All right, well, I guess you'll have to catch up with me later to see what that looks like. I think we switched formats from PowerPoint to Google and probably lost the link in it. Anyway, I'll just describe what happens in that. In this, it's about a 30-second video, and it's a bear leaving the forest and entering in the neighborhood, and it kind of looks watches the traffic, and even a man coming up on the sidewalk. So anyway, just to kind of give you an idea of encounters that they face and people face when bears and people come together. Sometimes those are adverse occurrences and someone might get injured. Other times it's totally benign, and most of the time it's totally benign. So a lot of this has to do with just learning how to live in areas where predators are. And bears really aren't interested in people. So it's just if you get in the wrong situation. So if you get between them and their food, or maybe a female and her cubs, then you've got a problem. And that work is centered towards, we're collecting data and all to help inform the Bearwise community programs in the surrounding neighborhoods to reduce conflicts, hopefully educate the residents more about bear and bear behavior, and so that it reduces and makes more compatibility and cohabitation adjacent to each other. Another project I wanted to talk about before I leave the stage here is the Wekiva Parkway project. So roads is another big issue that I described earlier, and this is a case where there was a 2-lane road that had perhaps about 22,000 cars a day, and it's about a 7-mile stretch, and we had over 105 bears killed on that little section of roadway. And this is one project that the Department of Transportation did to alleviate that problem and also restore a lot of disturbed habitat nearby, about 10,000 acres, and included these really large landscape level bridges to reconnect the landscape here. And that photo is just one of them down near the Wekiva River, all using native landscaping. So these are some of the measures that I work on to try to bridge that gap between urban areas and natural areas and in that urban wildland interface area. And so this is important work, and I'm excited to be a part of it, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan. Next, I'll invite Aaron Fegestead to the podium.
So good morning. So today I was asked to sort of take a practitioner's viewpoint and present on a long-term restoration project of an urban preserve in the Chicago suburbs, and that preserve is named Deer Grove. So welcome to Deer Grove East, and before I dive in though and give a tour and talk about the history of the project and all the aspects that were involved with the planning, I do want to just recognize the project partners that made it happen. First, the Forest Preserves of Cook County. They're the landowner, and they have over 300 named preserves in Cook County, and that's where the city of Chicago sits. And they own and manage over 70,000 acres, and those preserves draw over 60 million visitors annually. Open Lands, they're the project sponsor, and they were really the lead organization to plan, do public outreach, and implement the project. And Open Lands, they're a really important metropolitan conservation nonprofit organization in Chicago. They're one of the oldest metropolitan nonprofit organizations in the U.S., and they've been working on projects like this and championing protection of open spaces in Chicago for over 50 years. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the city of Chicago, because the work in part was funded by in lieu fee wetland mitigation through an agreement through the O'Hare Modernization Mitigation Account. The Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers, a community volunteer group that has been critical in sort of taking this view of long-term stewardship at the site. And then finally, Stantec, who was Open Lands' trusted design build partner. And I've had the fortune of working on the project for almost the entire 20 years, both as an ecologist and project manager. And I just want to say too, projects like this don't happen with the people on the ground doing the work, right? Restoration, oftentimes, it's kind of sweat equity, right? It's hard work. It can take a long time to get results. So really credit goes to the folks that are on the ground, the volunteers, the field technicians that are spending the tens of thousands of hours often to do these kind of projects. So the project is located in the far northwestern suburbs of Chicago. As the crow flies, it's about 25 miles south of the Wisconsin-Illinois border and about 30 miles northwest of downtown Chicago. And I really like this map. This is a USGS map that really shows, as Volker was talking about, that urban wildland interface. This is sort of a typical forest preserve in Chicago. There's hundreds, if not more than 1,000 forest preserves in the metro area. And then this is all of Deer Grove here. And Deer Grove has kind of historically been split into two sections. Deer Grove West, which had about 1,200 acres, was the first forest preserve dedicated in the United States. That was in 1916. That means it predates designation of national parks like Grand Canyon and Zion. And then the acquisition of Deer Grove East, which would be the focus of my talk moving forward, came in 1939, so 23 years after Deer Grove West. Deer Grove West, it didn't really suffer a lot of the effects of urbanization and agriculture like Deer Grove East did, but Deer Grove East was heavily degraded by agricultural activities, wetland drainage, mosquito abatement, ditching, grazing, and invasive species. And it goes without saying, these large preserves in Chicago, they're community gathering places. Deer Grove East is one of the most heavily visited preserves in the Forest Preserves of Cook County system. It offers nature-based recreation opportunities. On the figure there, that's a series of trails that work their way through the site. So there's hiking trails, bicycle and walking paths. There's multiple picnic groves that each can hold 300 people, a campground, a model airfield, and all the supporting amenities for that recreation. So very heavily utilized. So here we have a historic forest preserve. One side is heavily degraded, which presents opportunities for restoration in an urban area. And what the project partners really wanted to do, because at the time the Forest Preserves of Cook County weren't really kind of doing these types of projects. Today they're managing tens of thousands of acres of remnant areas, but these kind of de novo or from scratch restorations weren't really something that they were doing. So it was really an opportunity to take sort of an approach to create a model for smart restoration. And so that involved things very early on, from public outreach, open houses with the public, to really setting goals to avoid infrastructure impacts off-site and on-site, keeping the preserve and really the trails open to the public throughout the entire 20-year or so restoration project, being a good steward of the land, really being patient and taking the time that was needed to understand what was there and to steward, control invasive species, and not rushing to mediocrity, but really setting a standard that this is going to be a template moving forward for high-quality restoration in an urban area. Then I think really importantly, I'm going to hit on this later, but involving the community, both in the decision-making, but also in the stewardship, creating a relationship with the land and the community, that reciprocity, so that the community can take care of these sites and these urban areas long-term. So really a primary concern early in the process was potential for hydrologic trespass on off-site areas. So the areas in green are wetlands that were delineated. The red lines are all drain tiles that were mapped. And so there was a potential here for off-site hydrologic trespass. So there was a lot of due diligence put in place. It was about 2 years of baselining, modeling hydrology, doing a test tile break to see how that aligned with the hydrologic model, and then doing hydrology monitoring to really kind of focus in on areas where we would not have hydrologic trespass. So that resulted in really narrowing down that 600-acre project area to about 185 acres, and that's the area shown in blue, and that ended up being the core restoration area. Within that area, really the site showed those effects of the historic disturbance. The areas in green were degraded remnant oak ecosystems and wetlands that were degraded by invasive species. The mature oaks were present, but the system was really lacking that representative ground layer vegetation that's so important in these fire-dependent ecosystems. And the areas in yellow were areas that were tiled and drained and historically cultivated. And those areas had reverted to Eurasian meadow, really dominated by invasive species throughout. So here's what that looked like on the ground. Drained wetlands, these were effectively drained by drain tiles and ditches. Degraded wetlands, dominated by, herbaceous invasive species and woody invasive species. Eurasian meadow, predominantly non-native vegetation, and degraded oak ecosystem. So you can see a white oak there, a mature white oak, but completely choked with buckthorn. That's an all too familiar sight, I think, in our part of the country here, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, in these urban systems. And so, the core ingredients for ecological recovery, I think this is really a story about patience. Again, taking the time to understand what's there, taking the time to remove invasive species, and then using adaptive management. So we spent 2 to 3 years just prepping the site for a native seed and plant installations. Just in the initial seeding alone, over 3,000 pounds of seed, over 100,000 plugs, plus the thousands of pounds of seed that the volunteers eventually collected on site and added back into the system. Very frequent dormant prescribed burning. We were practicing annual fire regimes on this site. If we didn't do annual fire, it's because we had to be really sensitive to potential smoke impacts off-site. Native overseedings. So some of our best prairie restorations around, they haven't been seeded just once, they've been seeded multiple times following prescribed burns. So in this case, in some areas of the site, we did 3 to 4 overseedings. And then finally, really intensive vegetation management. We really set a high bar that there was a no seed set policy for invasive species. So if one single invasive plant went to seed, we were failing, right? So it was a really high bar and a really intensive vegetation management regime. Really core to this and important in urban areas, but important in any ecosystem, any fire-dependent ecosystem that really evolved with human intervention is community involvement, developing that reciprocal relationship with nature. And so early on in the process, Open Lands, working with the community, started Friends of Deer Grove East. And our president of the Midwest Great Lakes chapter of SCR, Mark Kivchenia, was really critical in that early phase. So I do credit to Mark, and he's sitting over there, and he's not looking at me, but he was critical in that process, along with all the other community volunteers. And these are just an example of some of the hours that have been spent by volunteers in the last 6 years. And important here is that the contractor, Stantec, was working directly with the volunteers, side by side in some cases, really to help train the volunteers and get them on their own feet, and they're very capable but as they become more sophisticated, they're really taking the lead on the stewardship long term. An example of some of the things that they do, seed collection. They've collected over 1,000 pounds of seed in the last 6 years and developed seed mixes that go back into the site to diversify it. Weed collection days. And this is a credit to the new site stewards, Ann and Sue, who continue to take Mark's legacy and the legacy of others and pushed us forward to create that reciprocal relationship with the land. So what everybody wants to see, before and after photos. Here's a before and after photo of a wetland restoration. So it went from a drained wetland to a highly diverse prairie pothole. Oak ecosystem enhancement from that very shaded, lacking underground layer to now a native herbaceous layer that those oaks are allowed to reproduce, regenerate. Typical prairie restoration. This was actually an area that was reforested historically, and then what it looks like today. And then the before and after Eurasian meadow to prairie conversion. And I think the proof is in the pudding, right? And it shows that these sites in urban areas, if there's good site selection, if there's a really strong vision, and there's that community engagement, that you can really achieve high biodiversity. The Cook County Forest Preserve System is a gold standard for biodiversity right in your own backyard if you live in these urban areas. And within 30 miles, you can get to 70,000 acres of natural area of downtown Chicago. So in Deer Grove, we saw 25 bird species of greatest conservation need start to use the site. We achieved really high habitat diversity, and because of that, we achieved almost 400 native plant species within about 10 years of the start of restoration. And because of that, this site that was highly degraded, a de novo restoration, was then dedicated as a land and water reserve under the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, and really, again, showcased what can be done in an urban setting. So let's take the last 3 slides or so here, and I just want to talk about how these projects can give back to the community, right? There's certainly a community benefit there when we get people out engaging with nature. We give them these nature-based recreation opportunities. But I want to talk quickly, too, about how these sites can provide hydrologic benefit and ecosystem services benefit in urban spaces. So Open Lands and the project partners really asked the questions, what was the benefit to, what was the stormwater benefit of this site in an urban system? And what was the ecosystem services benefit, both short-term and long-term, from the monies that were spent on the project and then the ecosystem services that were enhanced? So for this first study, we asked, how did the hydrology restoration and how did the conversion from predominantly non-native vegetation to native vegetation enhance the stormwater benefits of this project? And what you're seeing here, and we used EPA's stormwater management model, and it really showed a 90% reduction in off-site discharge as a result of the plugging drain tiles, doing the hydrology restoration. And over 2 stimulation years, that showed a benefit of retaining 20 million gallons on site relative to the baseline condition. So in an urban area and in the right context, this can have an obvious downstream stormwater benefit. On the economic side, we wanted to understand, okay, how did the money spent to actually implement the project, how did that stimulate the economy locally in the short term? And to do this, we use what's called the in-plan economic model, or impact analysis of planning model. This is commonly used by the Forest Service and Park Service to look at the impact of their spending, conservation spending on the economy. Essentially what this does, it takes a local data package and it simulates how $1 is spent on the project and how that's kind of routed through the local economy in the long term. And so we saw a temporary regional effect of over $10 million during the expenditure period, or the time taken to construct the project, which was a 2-to-1 return on investment. And then we're also interested in the long-term economic effects, and that was really getting at how is this restored site enhancing ecosystem services that benefit people in an urban area. So things like water flow regulation, water quality, carbon sequestration. The first aspect of that was really using willingness to pay surveys and visitation data to look at what was the value, added value of the recreational opportunities presented for a restored landscape. And in fact, people are willing to pay more for access to restored landscape. That value over a 20-year period was assessed at $20 million. Then on the regulating support and habitat ecosystem services side, there was a major improvement primarily thanks to wetlands. Again, water flow regulation, water quality, and recharge as a result of all the wetland restoration that occurred was huge, right? $13.5 million over a 20-year period. Add that all up, that was a 6-to-1 return on investment to enhance those ecosystem services for the local community in the long term. And that's 20 years condensed into a short presentation, so if anybody wants more information, I did include some QR links here, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Next, I'll welcome Phil Nicodemus to the stage.
Hello, everybody. I am Phil Nicodemus. I'm with a nonprofit based in Chicago called Urban Rivers. I want to tell you guys a little bit about what we got going on in our flagship project, which is called the Wild Mile, as well as some other interventions in a very, very, very urban part of the same river systems that we were kind of just talking about in some of the previous talk. Urban waterways, and in this case, you know, urbanized can mean a lot of things. I kind of tend to think of an urban river as being anything that can't really carve its way through the landscape, but in this case, not only can it not carve its way through the landscape, but it also has a bunch of infrastructure that is built up alongside it that is what makes Chicago a city, what makes it so important to be there for civilization. Our specific area that we're focusing on is Goose Island. So this is the north branch of the Chicago River. You can see The normal course of the river is kind of wiggling along the west side of the picture there, and the east side is called the Ogden Canal. It was dug by the first mayor of Chicago, who happened to own a lot of that land, wanted to add some waterfront access to all this kind of industrial area. And it turned into a huge spot for shipping of lumber and grain and all this other stuff that would come into the city of Chicago, get processed, and sent back out to the rest of the country. The consequence of this is that the river system is extraordinarily altered. This is Rush Street Swing Bridge downtown. This just kind of gives you an idea of the sense of the importance of the river system when there were no highways. You can see the kind of emergence of the rail system kind of in the background, but also if you look pretty closely at this picture, you'll notice that there are no plants anywhere. That becomes an enormous problem for us. Not only that, we also have a lot of channelization going on. So this is the south branch of the Chicago River looking north. Navy Pier would eventually be built in the top right corner of that picture. But we see this meander that's here that they cut just straight through and are now filled in that river on the east side, on the right side of the picture there, and that's going to be where the new Chicago Fire Soccer Stadium is going to go in a year or two here. Let's see if we can advance. Very, very controlled system. So the Chicago River, Calumet River, is actually just a big pool. That normal historic connection that makes Chicago a really important place to be on the continent is bridging the gap between the Des Plaines River there and then the north and the south branch, which would normally meet together and then head out into the lake. In Chicago, we tried to build the city on top of a swamp, and that was not great for health. So then downtown, they jacked the entire downtown up on stilts. That's, if you've been to Chicago and you know Upper and Lower Wacker, that exists because they needed to raise the whole city to build sewers retroactively underneath it. That wasn't working, so then we dug 2 miles out into the lake to have water intakes that were well past the pollution that would be dumped out into the river or the lake from the river systems. That didn't work, and so then we ended up just saying, all right, whatever, we're gonna reverse the whole thing. Dug a bunch of these canals backwards. St. Louis was suing Chicago, so in the middle of the night, they went out and they blew up the dam and let the water rush back, and that reversed the river in a way that you couldn't really undo it. So now the old joke is we send our urine down to St. Louis and they send it back to us as Bud Light. Existing problems, we got a lot of them. People love dumping shit into the river. It is recreational in some cases. This is a building of a Salesforce tower. So this is Wolf Point. This is where all these rivers meet now and head out from the lake back down to the South Branch. This guy doesn't see any problem with this. This is people's perception of the river, is that it is dirty and polluted, and he sees no problem with, in broad daylight in front of 1 million people, dumping this construction gray water right into the river. He did get in trouble for that, but it just happened to be because someone who was going by in the water taxi recognized that as being something that you can't do. Until very recently, we've also had a very huge combined sewer overflow issues. In some cases, this would be very little, relatively little amounts of rain dumped very quickly. That causes the sewer system to back up, meaning that untreated sewage is entering in. Because of the TARP, the underground reservoir program, this is happening a lot less now, and it's an enormous success story, but this still does happen. Just over the last week, we had a pretty significant combined sewer overflow that meant that where it does come out, it's still enormously impactful on our recovering ecosystem. Also, fun one, cars. Cars, any place there is access to the river, people have a tendency to dump cars, maybe just because they don't want to deal with them anymore. Maybe they've stolen them and are trying to get rid of them. Maybe they just want to see the thing go splash. But this is just kind of part of the urban environment that you have to deal with. Again, underground reservoir plan, using our own limestone quarries as spare capacity for untreated water, so that when everything fills up in these reservoirs, it's, I think, 1 trillion gallons of storage now. Again, just the other day, filled up entirely There's one more reservoir that they still have to hook online, but this was designed at a time where 100-year floods were not happening every 10 years, which is kind of the situation we're getting ourselves into now. One of the problems with this urban environment is the entire thing is controlled by the lock and dam down at Lockport, Illinois, so it's a big pool. And so what happens is when they expect rain, they will draw the entire level of the river down about 2 feet at its most. Last year, they needed to get a barge under a bridge down south, so they lowered the whole level of the river by 2 feet within 48 hours. But it's also the only way to move water out of the city, so this will get as high as the seawall. So theoretically, you've got a 10-foot swing that could happen within the course of about a week, which creates very challenging issues for anything that you're doing restoration-wise or parks-wise. But what can we do? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out as an organization, is how do we use these areas and make them more vibrant, and like a lot of what the other kind of urban practitioners talk about, it's also reconnecting people with a water body that was re-engineered not for them. So this is our first little start. This is our co-founder. Even before we were a nonprofit, I was helping him do his master's thesis work on that little piece of crap right there. You could probably imagine a lot of problems with it. You know, there's too low in the water, so we had to go to the Home Depot that's in the background, buy some pool noodles and garden stakes underneath and get it out of the water more. Geese, we'd have to goose fence it all the way around. There's tons of problems, but the concept was that, yes, fish are more interested in the planted thing than just the blank canal or even the dock that he's standing on. So this was kind of our first step. This was our canvas. This again is that in that Ogden Canal, the Goose Island Canal. A lot of blank seawall. This is a new Whole Foods that they had recently built, and this is pretty fresh seawall. Instead of just letting it exist like this, where you see this is what happens a lot, where the top maybe gets some native plantings, but it's kind of just 10-foot sidewalk and maybe some native R's, you know, maybe some good stuff, but probably a lot of gardeny crap. So all we have to do is kind of add a little bit of a platform onto the space that we've got, and we can very easily add in a very specific type of vegetation. So this is our first install. This is beneath that same Whole Foods that we were just looking at. This is 2017. You can kind of see the modules fitting together. We get these all from Biomatrix Water in Scotland. They have pre-made rows that are covered in coconut coir, and it's rectangular pontoon, 4 pontoons that come together in a rectangle to create that structure. You bolt them together in whatever configuration fits your environment. And then this same spot 1 year later, it doesn't really take much. All you're doing is giving the native plants a platform to grow from. They're all growing hydroponically out of the river water. In our river water, there's tons of nutrient for them. So you get we probably planted about 50 or 60 different species on here. Over time, it's kind of winnowed down to about 20 or 30 that are very, very successful and seem to be able to handle the conditions pretty regularly. This is a hilariously out-of-date rendering, but yet we are very tip corner there. Where it says phase 1, we basically got that done by now. This is our floating boardwalk. So these are the installations of what is the backbone of this. This is what everything is anchored to. We have anchors sitting at the bottom of the river attached to elastics that allow the whole thing to float all the way up to the top when we have the elevated water, but then holds it tight as a comfortable walking path when the water is low. This is the foundation of giving people access. So there's also a kayak launch at the top, one end of it. But for the most part, this is just trying to get people closer to the river, because in Chicago, a lot of times, even if you do have a relationship with the river, if you can't rent a kayak or you can't easily access some of these better preserved park district areas or what have you, this is a good way to kind of get a lot of people down and experiencing this thing very cheaply and very easily, kind of in their own backyards. There we go, walkway. So that's the newer section that we just put in. We did this in 2024. That's just kind of an example of what the section looks just after we installed the boardwalk. Again, these floating gardens, people can walk on them. This is how we maintain them. Volunteers do a lot of the install and maintenance work. We have different types of modules. So those older modules are those pry apart rows. The newer ones is the same pontoon structure, but then you do a low landscaping fabric and you fill it up with a mixture of material. We use primarily mulch and then leca, which is lightweight expanded clay aggregates like aquarium gravel. And it becomes very quickly a rock star kind of the neighborhood. We do have problems with people not knowing where it is because it's kind of tucked away in this formerly industrial area. But as people discover it, it's really heartwarming to just be walking down and watch people kind of explore this space for the first time that for very long felt like it was inaccessible and not made for them. This is the newer section. Again, we did this in 24, so that walkway you saw just blankly, and now we have everything kind of filled in around it, so we're able to use that walkway to build out everything from there. We have native freshwater mussels that we're restoring, so we just go up further in the north branch, bring them over to a lab, get a bunch of them out, put them in these protective bunkers. Root systems growing deep underneath, so this is creating a lot of structure for things going below the water, and then we see kind of that nice, lovely green, pallid green color is what a lot of this looks like, but it's just great habitat for things even below water, and those root zones are also obviously doing a lot of the pollution removal. We've got some information on plant uptake, so this is nitrogen and phosphorus, and tons of science stuff that I'm just gonna flip through here, and you guys are gonna have to deal with it and ask me later about how all this stuff is working. So all of these things are great, numbers are good, fish are coming back, there's tons of opportunities for things that didn't have habitat before that have habitat now. And a lot of these things are things that existed here already, but are just have a place to shine and a place to be seen by people now in a way that really helps connect people with the fabric of their environment that they've been missing for so long. And a couple ending shots here of these floating wetlands, which I think where they're most important, where you have edges that have to be armored because you're in an urban environment. If you don't have the armoring, you get big erosion, and Laura's probably got to talk about that in a bit. These are at Park District locations, so it's a perfect marriage of where you have to have this armoring at the typical water line. We can then put the plants directly that should be in there directly back into the wetlands on the other side and kind of recreate some of what we've lost and can't really get back very easily in the city. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Phil. Next, we'll invite Lauren to the podium.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. I'll give you kind of a rapid-fire appetizer sampler of some of what this looks like from managing public park spaces in Chicago. So thanks for all those introductions. So most people think of park districts as playgrounds, tennis courts, pools, beaches. Of about the 8,000 acres or so that the Park District owns, about a quarter of them are managed as natural areas. So this is a pretty significant part of what we do. The team that manages and works in the natural areas is our environmental conservation and engagement team. So I won't read this definition, but what you'll be able to see is people are very much centric to our conservation. It's conservation and engagement very deliberately, that people are involved in all of the conservation work we do. I won't go into details, but we know there's a lot of challenges to managing urban natural areas. Site conditions, everything we have is constructed to some degree. We have no remnant ecosystems in the city proper, as far as I know. Perception, safety, politics, aesthetics, timelines, goals are all extra challenging. They're challenging in restoration in general, but particularly in the city. So our approach generally has to include both social goals and ecological goals as we go through things. So I'm just gonna give a couple examples of how that sort of works in practice. So first, starting with ecological restoration in Jackson Park. Most of us think of parks as these lovely recreational spaces, but if we go to the history of a place like Jackson Park, that was home to the 1893 World's Fair and designed 3 times by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm, he thought of parks as a work of art. So a place where people could have this very specific experience. It was more about what does this place do for people, for citizens in a city. So how do you do ecological restoration in an art piece? with a Japanese garden with a sculpture by Yoko Ono, with a very new, very famous neighbor adjacent to it. So in this case, we don't just think about ecological restoration and managing for biodiversity, but we have to kind of work at this intersection of ecological restoration, landscape architecture, and historic preservation, where you're not just making your decisions about your plant palette or your herbicide or your mowing from an ecological perspective. You have to think about historic intent and that art and that feel and those looks to be achieved that Olmsted intended when initially designing the park over 100 years ago. So sometimes we have to really respect the history of a park, and sometimes we bulldoze it. So this is the dam that was at the confluence of the North Branch of the Chicago River and the North Shore Channel that Phil already showed you a map of. So we, in the name of doing river riparian restoration, we knocked down this dam, and then we added some infrastructure to invite people to, as Phil sort of suggested, being out and experiencing the river. So having programs, and then this launch is also adaptive, so folks in wheelchairs or with any mobility issues can also have that same experience of getting on the water. We're also integrating art where possible into that infrastructure. So these are some river-inspired murals that are around some kayak and canoe lockers that folks can rent. So if you have your own boat, you can have it in a place so you don't have to have a car or a garage and lug and store it, which might be kind of challenging in the city. With some of our river restoration, there's also some really hard, painful lessons with some of that and how we communicate and how we talk about what restoration looks like in the city. So this is an example at Horner Park, again on the North Branch of the Chicago River. And there were some really ugly and hard to see headlines. Because a lot of us will know that river riparian restoration will eventually look like this, but in process, it looks like this. Bulldozers and knocking down trees doesn't feel like an environmentally responsible thing to do if you've not really been introduced to this concept of ecological restoration. So we've learned some lessons about how to talk about what restoration looks like, to set some expectations about timelines and about aesthetics and what things look like, inviting the public behind the construction fences in these early stages to be very upfront about what restoration looks like. Another example we're really proud of is the Burnham Wildlife Corridor. So this is a section on the lakefront between about 47th and McCormick Place, if you're familiar. So this is underutilized lawns that we had transformed in connection with some of our community partners. So some of these areas were in Bronzeville, which is sort of known as the Black Metropolis. It's also a place in the, where the rice riots of 1919 took place. This corridor also connects Chinatown and Pilsen. So those are neighborhoods with a really rich immigrant history. So instead of ignoring the people stories of migration, we are also embracing those with our partners at the Field Museum to create these routes and routes. So how do people culturally relate to these spaces? It's not just migration corridors for people or for birds and bees and everything else that go through those areas, but also for people. So how do they interact with these spaces, celebrate their culture, and how are they invited to these spaces that include people, not just nature? We do also sometimes think specifically about species, not just people all the time. So our great success with Monty and Rose, the Great Lakes piping plovers that nested at Montrose Beach in Cook County for the first time in over 50 years, and really kind of captured the hearts of Chicagoans. So partnering with federal partners and hundreds of volunteers to monitor every little step these little floofs took. We also look at exploring the habitat potential of post-industrial landscapes. So on the far southeast side of the city, a lot of our steel industries, which is what built Chicago, also dumped an obnoxious amount of slag, so as byproduct from the steel production industry, into a lot of our wetlands and dune and swale systems that made up the coast of Lake Michigan. So what do you do when you try to restore something that looked like this at some point 100 years ago? So sometimes these slag sites look like prairies. Sometimes they look like another planet. Sometimes they look like abandoned parking lots. And if we think about them a little bit, these are nothing that exists naturally, but they do kind of resemble a novel ecosystem. So if we ignore the origin of the slag, but we think about it as a soil. It does have a lot of similar characteristics to some of our native remnant ecosystems of the region. So dolomite prairies or possibly gravel hill prairies. So can we use that as a way to sort of direct what restoration on these slag sites look like? And if we start looking closely at some of those Marsscapes or gravel scapes, we start to see some really cool plants growing in the nooks and crannies of those very unnatural spaces. And we even found a new species that hadn't been seen since 1894, Elaeocris geniculata. Those are my colleagues, Allison Anastasio and Nathaniel Pilla, who discovered that. And last but not least, thinking of wastelands, there's lawns, and a lot of them in Chicago and all over. And I think folks in this room would think a lot about what lawns could become, and we all agree with that. So we're partnering with the Botanic Garden and University of Michigan Flint, and a project that's funded by NSF and Allen Family Philanthropies to sort of look at what these ecosystem services are of our existing lawns, of our natural areas, and exploring this potential, since we can't necessarily have tall grass prairies everywhere in the city. Where can some of our short stature native plants be these sort of lawn alternatives in some iconic spaces? So hopefully I was fast enough so we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We have about 8 minutes left in this session, and we've got time for questions. So there are a couple microphones set up on either end of the stage. This is your time to ask all your burning urban and conservation-related questions. Yeah, so we'll give it a few seconds here if people have questions. Otherwise, I'll kick it off with a general question for our panel. Yeah, if you can come up to the microphone, please do.
Hi. Hi, I have a question, and I beat her to the microphone.
Excellent.
No, that's okay. Thank you all for your really interesting presentations. I had a question for Aaron. How do you think, or what information do you have about how people's relationship to this piece of land has changed?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, microphones are on. Yeah, really good question. You know, I think, again, like I said, it's always been one of the most heavily visited forest preserves. And I think there's always a draw to really any sort of green space, right? And people don't always know whether it has high ecological integrity or low ecological integrity. And I think probably the eye-opener was during the restoration process, you know, even though you have the communication on the front end, and Lauren alluded to this too, like the site just changes. Like things often look worse before they get better on these types of restorations. And when we turned the corner and things started to heal from all the seeding and planting and stewardship, we went from comments like, oh, I didn't realize that this is what healthy nature looks like. And this is from people just using the trails, people that necessarily didn't have any ecological education, may or may not have been involved with, you know, some of the open houses earlier on. And so I think people just, you know, when you give them the opportunity to interact, even if they're on the trails, I mean, you know, you hear more birds and you see more insects and you see more color and there's different scents and, you know, all that. So I think people just, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, it's like, you know, the psychology of, you know, of being drawn to healthy nature. I think it's just kind of like an innate human thing. But clearly the visitation increased. I think some of that was word of mouth. And I think some of that, too, is just really with the community engagement with the volunteers and having them help spread the word and really kind of, you know, in the community be that advocate for that reciprocal relationship. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but that's kind of my take.
Thank you.
Over here.
Yeah, regarding the floating wetlands, can you talk a little bit about the process of going from idea to prototype to implementation? Because it's absolutely fantastic, and I could see that being applicable a lot of places, but I can't imagine the process that went into getting everybody on board with that.
Oh, yeah, it was, it took a lot of convincing. I think that, especially in very urban environments, there is a real hesitation to do anything that is outside of the box. But that goes both ways. It's everybody who is nervous about it. The city doesn't want to allow something that may fail because that's very public and it's going to be seen as a waste of public money, which nobody wants to be a part of. A developer doesn't really want to deal with something that's untested. They just want to have the work be done and make their money and move on. So everything was just kind of, we got told by a lot of people that it either wouldn't or couldn't happen. It's not going to work, this and that. And as we're kind of pushing more and more, dealing with more bureaucracy, dealing with more pushback, you kind of realize that increasingly those people were just kind of doing what was instinctive to them rather than actually kind of thinking about it. But once they started to trust us, once we were able to build trust and demonstrate that at least a pilot version of it would work, then it was like, oh yeah, well this is a no-brainer then. If it works, if we have some assurance. So the biggest hump was getting from the point where we're just a couple of bright-eyed kids trying to use underutilized space to the point where it's actually something that people can go visit and see and tangibly experience, and that has opened the doors for us. So it was a really initial kind of pushback early on, but then once the kind of process is proving itself, I don't know of anybody that really, isn't excited about it being included in their projects or, however it gets around. We've talked to many, many cities now, helping them kind of explore how they would do this in their context or different projects from different contractors and things like that. It's a great solution. It's just people get really, really nervous and can't allow things to fail because it's their professional relationship or their political career that's on the line.
I had a question about the slag sites. If there's any phytoremediation being used to restore the soil chemistry or anything like that so that it's a more usable landscape?
Yeah, so sometimes there's heavy metals in slagscapes and sometimes they're not. So there was a pilot study with UIC looking at phytoremediation but basically it didn't do anything. So we've gone from sort of thinking about it from this contamination lens, and I'm an ecologist, so I don't think about those metals or contamination in that same way. So it's really been just, rather than taking the initial approach, was cover it with topsoil, put down a seed mix, and do something very ordinary, was, we didn't have the money to do it to start with, so now we're starting to look at what are they, and don't think of this as a new prairie restoration. It is not an ecosystem that exists elsewhere in the world, or it does exist in lots of places as slag is dumped all over. But what is it? Don't make it something that it isn't. So we're not really thinking about the remediation in that same way, just really the ecological potential.
Thank you.
Dr. Smith, have you evaluated any of your current corridor networks or modeled any of your planned future networks in terms of circuit theory, resistance theory?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've done, I actually showed, one of the slides you saw, there was an omniscape model. So we have done some of that, and actually we're planning to explore that more, doing species connectivity models on a number of different species using that, and other methods as well. So there was a paper that came out, I'm thinking in 25, led by Yves Bonnet, which is in our lab, multiple authors on that, looking at a multi-species, multi-model approach to identifying and I guess optimizing the results from using different modeling approaches and identifying the best features of each model.
Thank you. And unfortunately, in an effort to keep this day on schedule from the beginning, we're going to wrap up here. Please come up and ask questions of our panel afterwards. And a big round of applause to all of our speakers. Have a great day at the conference. Thank you.